Jacob Doyle stood frozen in the doorway of his own kitchen, the word hanging in the air between him and his three sons like smoke after a gunshot. Sunshine. His youngest, 7-year-old Pete had called her Sunshine. Clear as a bell, easy as breathing, as though the name had always belonged to her. And all three boys had laughed the way children laugh when something feels perfectly, naturally right, the kind of laughter that has no secrets in it, no hidden motive, no trap. But Jacob Doyle, a man who had spent 11 years learning to distrust things that felt natural, a man who had buried one woman and promised himself he would never be fool enough to let another one inside his chest, stood at the threshold of his own home and felt something dangerous move through him. Something he had not felt in a very long time. He watched her. Sallie Merriweather was standing at his cookstove with her back to the door, her dark brown hair pinned up but escaping in strands around her neck the way it always did by mid-morning, and she was laughing too. The sound of it moved through the kitchen like something warm, like sun coming through a cracked shutter after a long winter, and Jacob Doyle, who prided himself on being a man of iron will and harder silences, felt the word form in his own chest before he could stop it. Sunshine. He stepped back out onto the porch before she could turn around and see him standing there like a man struck by lightning. He pressed one hand flat against the rough wood of the doorframe and breathed through his nose. The Nevada morning was already hot. The Doyle Ranch spread out before him in the pale gold of early June 1882, the corrals and the hay barn and the long slope of the eastern pasture running all the way to the ridge where the pines started. He had built every post of this place with his own hands. He had bled on this land. He had buried his wife in this land, in the small shaded corner behind the house where the wild clover grew. He had not intended to hire Sallie Merriweather. He had not intended to let her stay past the first week. He had not intended for his boys to give her a name that sounded like a prayer. But here he was. 6 weeks into an arrangement he had told himself was purely practical, and the woman inside his kitchen had apparently already become someone his sons loved enough to name. He needed to know where that had come from. He needed to understand it. And the moment he decided he was going to walk back inside and ask her directly, he understood that the real danger was not the nickname at all. The real danger was how badly he wanted an excuse to hear her talk to him. He pulled his hat down low and went back inside. To understand how Jacob Doyle arrived at that doorframe with his heart hammering like a green colt hitting a fence, you have to go back to the morning 6 weeks earlier when the stagecoach from Reno pulled into the town of Copperfield, Nevada, and a woman stepped down onto the main street with a single leather traveling case, a letter of reference from the minister of St. Catherine's Parish in Elko, and a look on her face that told anyone paying attention she was starting over from something that had cost her considerably. Jacob had been in town that morning to collect a parcel from the dry goods store and to have a word with Walt Hennessy, the man who ran the Copperfield telegraph office, about a dispute over the eastern fence line that had been simmering between the Doyle Ranch and the neighboring Aldridge property for the better part of the spring. He had not been looking for a housekeeper. He had posted a notice 3 weeks ago and received no serious responses, and he had more or less resigned himself to another summer of burned beans and shirts that smelled faintly of cattle. He saw her standing on the boardwalk in front of the stage office, reading the notice board with an expression of focused attention that reminded him, absurdly, of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. She was not what he would have imagined, though he had tried not to imagine anything. She was perhaps 28 or 29, tall for a woman in that era, with dark eyes and a steady kind of stillness about her that was different from shyness. She wore a plain brown traveling dress that had seen better days but was meticulously clean and pressed, and she held that leather case with both hands in front of her, as though it was the only thing in the world she was entirely sure about. He noticed she read his notice twice. He told himself he was not going to walk over there. He bought his parcel from the dry goods store and had his conversation with Walt Hennessy, and argued about the fence line for 20 minutes with the kind of dull, productive hostility that boundary disputes between ranchers always produced. And then he walked directly across the street to where the woman was still standing. She heard him coming and turned before he reached her, and he saw that her eyes were darker than he had expected, the kind of brown that was almost black, and she looked at him with that same quality of focused attention she had given the notice board. "You the one who wrote this?" she asked. She had a low voice, clear and direct, with a trace of something Eastern in it, not high-class Eastern, just somewhere that was not the desert. "Jacob Doyle," he said. "My ranch is about 4 miles northeast." "Sallie Merriweather," she said. She did not offer her hand, which he respected. "The notice says you have 3 sons. 12, 10, and 7, he said. "Thomas, Eli, and Pete. They are not easy boys, but they are not bad ones." She looked at him for a moment with that calculating stillness. "And a wife, dead," he said. It came out more flat than he meant it to, the way it always did, because after 4 years he still had not figured out how to say it with the right amount of grief and the right amount of finality at the same time. 4 years ago. Fever. She absorbed this without the flinching sympathy he was used to. She just nodded once slowly and looked back at the notice board as though she was confirming a detail. "The notice says cook, clean, and mind the boys," she said. "What it does not say is whether you are a decent man to work for." He blinked. In 11 years of running a cattle operation in Nevada, no one had ever asked him that quite so directly. He had asked it of other men. He had never been asked it himself. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I have been told I am not easy to talk to." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile but close. "That is a fair answer," she said. "When do we start?" He discovered, over the following 2 days of getting her settled in the small room off the kitchen that had previously been used to store winter blankets, that Sallie Merriweather came from Elko originally, that she had no living family in Nevada, that she had been working as a seamstress and occasional laundress in Reno for the previous 2 years, and that she was not going to tell him anything else about her history, unless he earned it by telling her something about his. He discovered this last fact when, on the second evening, she asked him directly why he had hired a single woman to live on his property, rather than the more conventional arrangement of bringing in a local widow from town to come and cook by the day. He had opened his mouth to give her the practical answer, which was that the 4-mile ride made daily help impractical, and that the boys needed consistency, which was all true. But she was looking at him again with those dark, patient eyes across his kitchen table, and the practical answer dried up in his throat. "My boys have not had a woman around in 4 years, he said instead. "I keep hiring day help from town and they keep driving her off within a week because they are testing whether she will stay. I need someone who will stay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a different reason than the one on your notice board." "Yes," he said. "A better one," she said, and she went back to reading the letter she had been writing, which she sealed and posted the next morning and never mentioned again. The boys did test her. Thomas, the oldest at 12, was the sophisticated kind of difficult. He went about it with a cold politeness that made it perfectly clear he did not want her there, and intended to make the experience quietly miserable for everyone until she left. He spoke to her in clipped formal sentences, and declined to answer any question. She asked him about his preferences at meals or his schedule for chores, communicating his opinions entirely through the medium of things not done and things left slightly wrong, a bed made to the barest technical minimum of acceptability, a plate cleaned with the mechanical efficiency of a boy who intends to give no satisfaction. Eli, at 10, was a different problem. He was not hostile, he was sorrowful, and he had the deep, resigned sadness of a child who has loved someone and had them taken away, and has decided it is simpler not to start again. He was polite enough, but he floated through her presence like a ghost, present in the room but absent from it in every way that mattered, and she found this harder to address than Thomas's cold campaign because grief is not a fortress you can storm. Pete, the youngest at 7, had no strategy at all. He simply appeared in the kitchen doorway on her first morning, regarded her with enormous brown eyes that were entirely his father's eyes, and said, "Can you make flapjacks?" She made flapjacks. Pete declared them the finest flapjacks in the entire territory of Nevada. This was a minority position in the Doyle household for the first several days, but it was stated with such absolute conviction that it eventually became a kind of household fact by sheer repetition. She won Eli more slowly. It happened on a Thursday morning in the third week when she found him sitting on the back porch with a wood carving he had been working on, a horse, and it was good work, careful and patient. She sat down beside him without asking and watched him work for several minutes without saying anything, and then she asked him how long he had been doing it. He was surprised enough by the lack of fuss that he answered honestly, and by the end of that conversation, which stretched for almost an hour in the morning quiet, she knew that his mother had taught him that the carving knife had belonged to her, and that he kept it wrapped in a piece of green cloth in the bottom of his trunk. She said, "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." It was the right thing. It was exactly the right thing. She said it simply, without treading carefully around it, without the evasive tenderness that adults usually offered children about dead parents, and Eli looked at her for a long moment with those serious 10-year-old eyes, and then looked back at his carving and said, "She was." After that, he started appearing in the kitchen in the evenings while she cleaned up from supper, ostensibly to do nothing in particular but actually to talk, which he did in gradually increasing amounts as the weeks went by. Thomas held out the longest. Thomas Doyle was 12 years old and the firstborn son of a man who worked by principle rather than sentiment, and he had inherited this quality in full. He had a logic, and the logic was, if she stays and we stop fighting her, we are saying our mother can be replaced. It was a sound logic for a 12-year-old carrying 4 years of grief. The flaw in it was that Sallie Merriweather was not attempting to replace anyone. She made this clear on a night in the fourth week when she found Thomas sitting in the main room alone after his brothers had gone to bed, staring at the photograph that sat on the mantelpiece. It was the only photograph the Doyle family had, a formal studio portrait from 1875, showing Jacob Doyle at perhaps 26 and a fair-haired woman who had to be his wife, and they were not touching in the photograph because that was how portraits were done. But there was something in the angle of their bodies toward each other that was unmistakably intimate. Thomas heard her come in and went rigid. She did not say anything immediately. She stood beside him and looked at the photograph, and then she said, "She has your eyes." Thomas stared at the photograph. His jaw was working. "She does," he said very quietly. "Does it bother you," Sallie asked, "that I am here?" A long pause. Then in the voice of a boy trying very hard to be a man, "It is not what I would have chosen." "That is fair," she said. "It is not what any of you would have chosen, and I am not here to tell you that it should feel like what you would have chosen." She looked at the photograph for another moment and then said, "I can promise you this much. I am not here to make anyone forget her. That is not what I was hired to do, and it is not what I intend." Thomas said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Why are you here then?" she said. "Because your father needed help, because you all needed something to be steady, and because I needed somewhere to land." She turned and went back to the kitchen and left him alone with the photograph. After that, Thomas was not warm. Warmth was not his way, but he was fair, and for a 12-year-old boy carrying a hidden motive of self-protection dressed up as loyalty, fair was a significant concession. It was in the fifth week that she first noticed Jacob Doyle watching her. She had thought in the first weeks that he was simply assessing her work. He was a man who ran an operation with a precise attention to quality, and he would check things, the meals, the state of the house, the boys' clothing and their behavior, in the same methodical way he checked fences. She understood this, and she did not mind it. She was good at her work, and she knew she was good at it, and being assessed by a competent person did not alarm her. But in the fifth week, she began to notice that the watching was happening at different times. It was happening when she was not working. It was happening when she was reading in the evening, or when she was sitting on the porch in the early morning before the boys were up, or when she was talking to Pete and not paying attention to anything outside that conversation. She would look up and Jacob Doyle would be there in the periphery, not staring, nothing so unguarded as that, just aware of where she was in the way that a man who has never stopped being a hunter is always aware of everything that moves within his sight. She decided not to address it because addressing it would require acknowledging that she had noticed it, and acknowledging that she had noticed it would require acknowledging certain things she was not yet ready to acknowledge about what it felt like to be watched by Jacob Doyle. The man himself was harder to read than she had expected, and she was not a woman who usually found men hard to read. He was 37 years old. She had learned this from Pete, who reported all family facts with the confidence of a town crier. Tall and angular in the way of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives, weathered rather than worn, with dark hair that had started going silver at the temples, and the kind of quiet that was not emptiness but weight. He was not a talkative man, but when he spoke, his sons listened, and she had noticed early that he had never once in 6 weeks spoken to any of them in anger. He was not gentle exactly. He was precise. He chose his words the way a carpenter chooses his tools. She had been watching him too. She admitted that to herself on a night in the middle of the 5th week, alone in the small room off the kitchen with the window open to the warm Nevada dark. She had been watching him, and she had been thinking things she had no business thinking about an employer. And she had a dark past of her own that included one very specific reason why she had come to believe that thinking those kinds of things about men who had power over your circumstances was a good way to get badly hurt. His name was Gerald Holt. He had been her employer in Reno, the man who owned the seamstress shop where she had worked for 2 years. He had been polite, and then increasingly less polite, and then, in the final month before she left Reno, he had made it comprehensively clear that he considered her gratitude a form of payment she had not yet rendered. She had left Reno with her traveling case and her letter from the minister, and a very clear understanding of the difference between a man who watches a woman because he is calculating what he can take from her, and a man who watches a woman because he does not know what else to do with the feeling. She thought, carefully, late in those nights in the room off the kitchen, that Jacob Doyle was the second kind. She thought this, but she was not sure enough to act on it. And so she did not act on it. She cooked his meals and minded his sons and read her books in the evenings and let the summer move over the Nevada desert at its own slow burning pace, and she waited, not for him to do something, but for herself to become certain. The name happened on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week. She had been outside since just after sunrise, hanging wash on the line in the side yard, and it was already warm with the particular dry heat of Nevada in June, and the light was coming in flat and gold across the pasture, and she had her face turned up to it for a moment with her eyes closed, just breathing it in. She did not know that all 3 boys were watching her from the kitchen window. She did not know that Pete had turned to his brothers and said, in perfect, simple 7-year-old logic, "She looks like sunshine." She did not know that Thomas had been quiet for a moment and then said, in a voice that was, for the first time, entirely without armor, "Yeah, she kind of does." She did not know that Eli had been the one to start it, calling across the yard when she came back in, "Morning sunshine," with a small private smile that was the most warmth she had seen him produce at one time, or that Pete had immediately seized on it and repeated it 4 more times in the next hour with the enthusiasm of a child who has found a new and wonderful word, or that even Thomas, at supper that evening, had used it once, quickly, quietly, as though it had just slipped out. She had responded to it naturally, instinctively, the way you respond to your name when someone calls it, because it had felt, in the warm, easy language of that family, like exactly what it was. A door opening. It was the morning after this that Jacob Doyle had been standing in the doorway watching her laugh with his sons, and had stepped back out onto the porch and pressed his hand against the doorframe and thought the word himself. He came back inside. He waited until the boys had scattered to their morning chores. Pete went to feed the chickens, Eli to check the water trough in the south corral, Thomas to the barn where he had taken on the main responsibility for the horses at 12, with the solemn competence that was very particularly his. Jacob Doyle poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "Where did the name come from?" Sallie Merriweather was at the wash basin with her back to him. She went still for just a moment, then continued what she was doing. "Which name?" she asked. "You know which name," he said. She dried her hands on her apron and turned around. She leaned back against the edge of the wash basin, with her arms loosely crossed, and looked at him with those direct dark eyes. And the morning light was coming through the east window, and it was doing something to the escaped strands of hair around her face that he was not going to think about. "Pete said it first," she said. "Yesterday morning I was hanging wash outside. And you were not bothered by it." She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything, taking it seriously rather than deflecting it. "No," she said, "I was not bothered. Should I have been?" He looked down at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands the way he did when he was working something out. "No," he said finally. "I just wanted to know where it came from." She waited because she had learned that he usually had more than one layer to a question. He looked up. "It means they trust you," he said. "When my boys make up a name for someone, it means they trust them." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because," she said carefully, "it is the same way they would have done it with anyone they trusted," quietly, like it was always true. She paused. "Pete has been calling me it for a full day, and it took you until this morning to ask about it." "I was working it out," he said. "Working out whether to be angry. Working out whether to be afraid," he said. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The sound of Pete's voice could be heard distantly from the direction of the chicken coop. Some kind of argument he was having with a particularly uncooperative hen. The familiar domestic sound of it moved through the room like something necessary. Jacob Doyle put his coffee cup down and said, "You are very good with them." "They are very worth being good with," she said. He nodded. He stood up and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. He was going to put it on and go back to work because that was what he did when a conversation got too close to the territory he did not know how to navigate. She watched him do this with the patient understanding of a woman who has learned to read exits. At the door, he stopped. Without turning, he said, "Why did you leave Reno?" It was not a question she had been expecting. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was sincere. It was the question of a man who had been wondering for 6 weeks and had finally decided to ask. She said, "Because I needed somewhere that felt like it could be mine." He did not respond to that. He went out the door and she heard his boots on the porch steps and then the sound of him crossing the yard toward the barn. She turned back to the wash basin and stood there for a moment with her hands still on the edge of it. She realized, in serious trouble. The following days moved with a heightened quality that she found both wonderful and alarming, the way everything becomes vivid when you are aware that something is shifting and you cannot quite see yet where it will settle. Jacob Doyle began talking to her. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. He had always been civil at meals and had always answered questions directly and had always thanked her for supper in the quiet, precise way he did everything. But talking was different. Talking was the thing he did with his sons in the evenings on the porch when the day was done, and the heat had begun to ease off. When Pete would sit on the bottom step with his chin in his hands, and listen to his father tell him things about the ranch and the cattle and the land, and Eli would carve, and Thomas would whittle or read, and Jacob Doyle would speak in his low, measured voice about the things that made up his days. She had always stayed inside during these evenings, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had understood instinctively that this was their time, private and necessary. But on the Wednesday after the nickname conversation, after supper, Jacob Doyle set his hat on the hook by the door and carried 2 cups of coffee out to the porch and left one of them on the railing near the side where there was a second chair that had never in 6 weeks been used. She looked at the chair through the window for a moment. Then she dried her hands, untied her apron, and went outside. Pete made room for her on the step without being asked. Eli looked up from his carving and back down again, but she caught the small private smile. Thomas said nothing, but she saw him, after a moment, shift his position slightly so that his back was not quite so definitively turned. Jacob Doyle handed her the coffee cup and said nothing. They sat in the warm Nevada evening and watched the colors change over the ridge and the cattle move in the far pasture like dark, slow water. And he began to talk, almost to himself, about the way the grass was looking on the south slope and what he thought it meant for the fall grazing. And she listened without trying to fill any of the silences. And after a while he asked her opinion about something she did not know anything about, and she said so. And he explained it patiently and then asked again. And she gave him an answer based on the explanation, and he considered it seriously. This became, over the following week, a habit. She did not know what to call the thing that was growing between them. It was not courtship, not in any conventional sense. There was no calling, no formal declaration of interest, no chaperonage or propriety of the kind that might have governed such things in a drawing room back east. But it had the quality of courtship in its intimacy, its gradualness, its accumulation of small specific moments of attention. He began to ask her questions in the evenings, not about her work, about her. What had she read as a girl? Whether she had ever lived on open land before or only in towns. What she thought about the stars, which were extraordinary over the Nevada desert on a clear night, the kind of density of them that made you feel the vastness of things. She asked him questions in return. About his wife, carefully, watching to see if it caused him pain that he did not want, but finding instead that he answered carefully, and with a kind of love that was entirely past tense in its sorrow but very present in its pride. Her name had been Clara. She had been from California originally, from a small town near Sacramento, and she had come to Nevada with her father when Eli was still a baby. She had been cheerful and stubborn and had argued with Jacob Doyle about virtually everything, which had, he said with a quiet glint in his eye, made for a very productive partnership. Sallie said, "You missed the arguments." He looked at her sideways. "I missed the noise," he said. "The place went very quiet after she was gone." "It is not very quiet now," she pointed out. Something moved in his face, something that might in a less careful man have been a smile. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She was sitting beside him in the porch light, and she was looking at his profile, and she was thinking about how it was that loneliness could become so ingrained in a person that they needed it to be quietly dismantled rather than suddenly removed, the way you would treat any injury, and she was thinking about this with the particular tender attention she applied to things she understood from the inside. She said, "What are you afraid will happen if it gets loud again?" He was quiet for a long moment. Pete had fallen asleep against her knee, which happened with a frequency that she still found extraordinary and precious, and Eli had gone into bed, and Thomas was reading inside by the lamp. It was just the two of them on the porch in the Nevada night. Jacob Doyle said that I will get used to it. She understood that immediately. Getting used to it meant needing it. Needing it meant being diminished when it stopped. Being diminished when it stopped was the thing he had survived once already, and he was not confident he could do it again. She said, "I am not going anywhere, Jacob." She used his first name. She had not done it before. She had not planned to do it now. It came out of the complete honesty of that moment, and she could not call it back. He turned and looked at her fully, the way he almost never allowed himself to, and she met his eyes in the warm dark, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you come from, Sallie Merriweather?" She smiled. "Elko originally." "That is not what I mean." She looked out at the darkness over the pasture. She had been waiting, she realized, for someone to ask this specific question. Not the logistical question, not the geography of it, but this question, the real one. Where did you come from? What made you what you are? Who were you before you arrived here with your single leather case and your letter of reference, and your look of someone who is starting over from something that cost her considerably? She told him about Elko. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher and had died when she was 21, leaving her with a small education, a love of books, and no money. She told him about the 2 years in Reno, the seamstress shop, the long hours, the isolation of being a woman alone in a western town in an era when a woman alone was perpetually suspect of something, either too respectable and therefore boring or not respectable enough and therefore dangerous, with no comfortable middle ground. She did not tell him about Gerald Holt. Not yet. That was a thing she held close, a dark past she had not yet decided he had earned the right to. But she told him enough. She told him enough that he was quiet for a long while afterward, and then he said, "You are not what I was expecting when I wrote that notice." "What were you expecting?" "Someone older," he said. "Someone who wanted a place to land for different reasons," she said. "The reasons matter. They tell you something about how long someone will stay." She looked at him. "I told you on the first day I needed somewhere to land." "You did," he said. "I have been thinking about that." And he looked down at his hands, those large, capable hands that showed every year of the work he had done. "And I think," he said carefully, "that landing somewhere does not have to mean you are staying out of desperation. It can mean you found the right place." She sat with that. She let it settle. She said, "Is that an observation or a question?" He said, "I am not entirely sure yet." She thought, "I am going to have to be very patient with this man." She thought this with enormous affection and no frustration at all. The next morning she was in the kitchen making bread when Thomas came in from the barn earlier than usual. He was dirty, and the set of his shoulders was tight in the way she had learned meant he was upset about something. She kept working the dough and waited. He went to the wash basin and scrubbed his hands with the rigorous efficiency he applied to everything, and then he stood there drying them and not leaving. She said, "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "Nothing happened," he said. "I was just thinking." She said, "About what?" A long pause. Then, with the enormous effort of a 12-year-old boy choosing honesty over armor, "About whether you are going to stay." She paused her work. She looked at him steadily. "Why are you thinking about that this morning?" Thomas set the towel down with careful precision. He said, "My father is different since you got here." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were so like the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Better different, but different," she said. "Are you worried about that?" He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "I thought I would be," he said. "I was planning to be, but I am not sure I am anymore." He looked at the floor. "I just need to know if you are going to stay, because if you are not, I would rather know now." She dusted the flour from her hands and turned to face him fully. "Thomas," she said, "I am planning to stay. I cannot make you a guarantee about the future because no one can, but I am not planning to leave, and I am not the kind of person who leaves without saying so first." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with that inherited precision that was so entirely his father's. "All right," he said. He picked up his hat from the peg and went back out to the barn. She turned back to her bread dough. She put her hands into it and felt the warm resistance of it, and thought about what it meant that a 12-year-old boy had just asked her a question she was fairly certain his father was also asking, in the particular silent language that Jacob Doyle used for things he was not yet ready to say out loud. It was the following week that Walt Hennessy came out to the ranch. He arrived on a Friday morning, which was unusual, because Walt Hennessy did not come out to the Doyle Ranch as a rule. He was a town man, a telegraph and post office man, with the indoor pallor of someone who lived in the company of paper and ink. But he arrived on a Friday morning on a borrowed horse looking somewhat embarrassed, and Jacob Doyle went out to meet him at the fence. She watched from the kitchen window. She could not hear the conversation, but she could see the shape of it, Jacob Doyle listening with his arms crossed, and his head slightly bowed in the listening posture she had come to recognize. Walt Hennessy, doing the talking with the specific manner of a man delivering news he has not been asked to deliver. Jacob Doyle's posture changed twice during the conversation. Once, partway through, it stiffened in a way that was not anger but alertness, the way an animal goes still before it moves. The second change was subtler. His arms uncrossed, and he looked out over the far pasture for a moment with an expression she could not read from this distance. After Walt Hennessy left, Jacob Doyle stood at the fence for a while. Then he came back to the house. He came into the kitchen and stood in the middle of it and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. "Walt had a telegram," he said. "For you." She went still. "For me." He thought it should come to you directly rather than sit in the office. He held out a folded paper. She crossed the kitchen and took it. She unfolded it and read it and then read it again. It was from a law office in Reno. Gerald Holt had filed a complaint against her with the Washoe County Civil Court, alleging theft of property from his premises before her departure from Reno. He was seeking damages. The letter noted she would need to appear before a magistrate if she intended to contest the claim, and that the hearing was set for the following month. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. She was aware that her hands were entirely steady, and she was grateful for this, because steady hands were necessary right now. Jacob Doyle said, "Who is Gerald Holt?" She looked at the folded paper on the table. She had told herself she would tell him when she was ready. She had not expected to be forced into readiness by a forged complaint filed by a vindictive man in Reno. She said, "He was my employer in Reno." She picked the paper back up and held it. "He is not a good man. When I left Reno, I took what was mine, a small amount of wages he owed me and a piece of cloth I had paid for myself. He is claiming I stole from him because he is angry that I left." Jacob Doyle said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her with that careful, steady attention. Then he said, "Did you take anything that was not yours?" She looked at him directly. "No," he said. "All right." "All right," she repeated. "All right," he said. "Then we will deal with it." Something large and complicated moved through her. She said, "You do not have to be involved in this. It is my problem." "You live on my property," he said, "and the complaint is false." He said this as though it settled the matter entirely, in the same tone he used when discussing fences and grazing rights and all the other practical facts of his world. "I will wire Elias Rourke in Reno. He is a lawyer I have used before. He will look at what Holt has filed and tell us what needs doing." She said, "Jacob." He looked at her. She said, "Why?" He seemed to consider the question. Then he said, "Because you are not going to be driven out of a place you have decided to stay in by a man with a false complaint." There was something in the way he said it, flat and certain, that told her this was not an employer protecting an employee. This was something else. This was a man saying, "I have decided this is where you belong, and I am not going to let anything threaten that." She said, "He is the reason I left Reno." Jacob Doyle went very still. She told him. She kept it factual and direct because that was how she survived things, by naming them plainly without drama. But she watched his face as she told him, and she saw the thing move through him. The controlled anger of a man who understands exactly what had happened and is choosing, carefully, not to let it direct him somewhere unproductive. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I am going to write to Elias Rourke today." She said, "I can pay for the lawyer myself when this is resolved." He said, "We will settle that later." He looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" The question was so simple and so direct that she felt it like something physical. She said, "I am now." They looked at each other across the kitchen in the late morning light, and the Nevada summer pressed against the windows, and Pete's voice could be heard from the yard where he was telling one of his elaborate stories to himself, and to whatever audience of chickens and fence posts would listen. And Sallie Merriweather thought, "There it is. There is the thing I have been trying not to name." She was in love with Jacob Doyle. She was in love with his seriousness and his steadiness, and the way he had said, "We will deal with it," about her trouble, and the way he asked his sons questions and actually listened to the answers, and the way he had started leaving that second cup of coffee on the porch railing every evening, and the way his voice changed very slightly when he talked about Clara, tender and finished, a man who had loved once completely and was not pretending otherwise. She thought, "I am in love with this man, and I am about to be tangled up in a mess in Reno, and I am not sure this is the best possible timing." She thought, "There is probably no good timing for this." She thought, Pete calls me Sunshine, and Thomas trusts me enough to ask me to stay, and Eli shows me his carvings in the evening, and Jacob Doyle leaves coffee on the railing for me every night. And this is the most at home I have felt in my entire adult life." She said none of this. She picked up the folded telegram and put it in her apron pocket and went back to making bread. The matter with Gerald Holt took 3 weeks to resolve, during which Elias Rourke in Reno produced the original shop ledger showing that Sallie Merriweather was owed back wages of $4.60, and Sallie produced the receipt she had kept, because she kept all her receipts, for the piece of cloth she had paid for herself, and the magistrate dismissed the complaint with a brevity that suggested Gerald Holt had wasted the court's time. The hearing was conducted by letter and by proxy, and Sallie did not have to go to Reno, for which she was quietly grateful. Gerald Holt did not pursue the matter further. She later heard, through a letter from a woman she had known slightly in Reno, that he had moved operations to Sacramento, which was sufficiently far away to feel like something closed. On the night that Jacob Doyle received the final letter from Elias Rourke confirming the dismissal of the complaint, he read it at the kitchen table and then folded it and handed it across to her without a word. She read it and then sat back and let out a long breath. He said, "Over." She said, "Over." He got up and went to the cupboard and took down the bottle of whiskey he kept for occasions, poured 2 measures, and set one in front of her. She looked at it and then looked at him, and he sat back down and raised his glass, and she raised hers, and they drank. She said, "Thank you," he said. "I told you we would deal with it." She said, "Yes, you did." They sat in the kitchen in the evening quiet with the whiskey glasses on the table between them, and outside the window the Nevada night was full of stars, and the house was settled into its sleeping sounds around them, the creak of the boards and the distant breathing of the cattle, and the small comfortable noises of a place that is inhabited and therefore alive. Jacob Doyle said, "Sallie." She looked at him. He said, "I would like to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you answer I will not change anything about your situation here." She said, "All right." He looked down at his hands and then back up at her. He was a man unaccustomed to this particular kind of speech. She could see him choosing words with the same care he used for everything, each one turned over before it was placed. He said, "I have been thinking since that night on the porch when you said you were not going anywhere." He stopped. "I have been thinking a great deal." She waited. He said, "I think you know what I am trying to say." She said, "I think you should say it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted in his face, the slightest easing, as though a tension he had been carrying for a long time had found somewhere to put itself down. He said, "I have not let myself think about another person in 4 years, not in this particular way. I had reasons for that, and most of them were good reasons." He paused. "And then you arrived with your leather case and your references, and you made Pete flapjacks on your first morning, and you found out how to get through to Eli by sitting quiet, and you told Thomas the truth, and you did not try to take anything from any of us, and you have been here 6 weeks, and somehow my house sounds the way it used to sound." She said nothing. He said, "I am not a man who says things like this easily." "I know," she said. "Then you know," he said, "what it costs me to say that I am." He stopped. He looked at her. "That when you said you were not going anywhere, I felt something I have not felt in 4 years, and I did not know what to do with it, so I have been sitting with it for 3 weeks. She said, "Jacob," he said, "I am still talking." She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. He said, "I am not going to ask you something that puts you in an uncomfortable position. You work for me, and that has a power to it that I am aware of. I am not going to use it." He took a breath. "But I would like to know whether what I am feeling is entirely one-sided." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the whiskey and the letter of dismissal between them, and she thought, "I have been waiting for this man to get here, and he has gotten here slowly, with enormous care, in exactly the way that a man like him would." She said, "It is not one-sided." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said with that absolute quiet certainty that was so entirely him, "All right." She said, "All right." "All right," he said. "Then I would like to court you properly if you are willing, and I would like to do it in full view of my sons, because they are going to know regardless, and I will not have them think there is something to hide." She said, "That is the most Jacob Doyle way to say what you just said." He looked at her steadily. "Is that a yes?" she said. "Yes." He picked up his whiskey glass and raised it once more, and she did the same, and they drank again. And it was simple and direct and entirely without the theatrical embellishment that the moment might have received in a novel, and it was exactly right. She lay awake in her small room for a long time that night, not with anxiety, but with a particular quality of happiness that she had learned to be careful with. The fragile and specific joy of something you had stopped expecting, and then found anyway. She had told herself in Reno that she was not made for certain things. She had been wrong. She was made for exactly this. This house, these boys, this man and his serious hands and his careful words and the second cup of coffee on the porch railing. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. She fell asleep to the sound of the Nevada night and slept better than she had in a very long time. In the morning she came out to the kitchen and Jacob Doyle was already there, which was not unusual, but he looked up when she came in with an expression that was new, open in a way his face rarely was, and she felt herself smile before she could arrange her face into anything more composed. Pete came in directly behind her, barefoot and trailing hay, and said, "Good morning, sunshine," with enormous energy, and Sallie Merriweather said good morning back. And Jacob Doyle watched this with something in his face that was warm and deliberate and entirely unhidden. And Pete looked between the two of them with the acute animal perception of a 7-year-old who knows something is different but cannot name it yet. He said, "Why is Papa looking at you like that?" Jacob Doyle said, "Go put your boots on, Pete." Pete looked at his father. He looked at Sallie. A slow, enormous smile spread across his face. "Oh," he said. He turned and went to get his boots, and Sallie heard him at the end of the hallway making a small sound of triumph that sounded like yes. She met Jacob Doyle's eyes over the stove. He looked for the first time in 6 weeks like a man who had put something heavy down. She said, "Your youngest is not subtle," he said. "He never has been." She turned to the stove and began the morning's work, and he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her, not on the railing, right there next to her, and she did not remark on the change in distance, but she felt it. Over the following weeks the courtship was, as promised, conducted with a transparency that his sons could not have missed if they had been blind and deaf. It was not extravagant. It was Jacob Doyle, and Jacob Doyle did not do extravagance. But he began to accompany her on the Saturday morning ride into Copperfield when she went to pick up the household provisions, which had previously been a solo task. He began to show her things about the ranch with a purposefulness that was different from simple orientation, the places he was planning to expand, the pasture to the north that he was thinking about fencing in, the way the water ran down from the ridge in the spring. He was showing her the future. She began to understand that Jacob Doyle courted the way he built fences, methodically, with attention to whether each post would hold before he moved to the next one. Eli noticed first. Eli, who had the quiet observational precision of a boy who processed the world through his hands and his eyes, said to her one evening while he was showing her a new carving, a hawk with spread wings and remarkable detail in the feathers. "My father is happy," she said. "Is he?" Eli said. "He has not been for a long time." He looked at the carving and turned it in his hands. "I thought maybe he just forgot how," she said. "I think he just needed the right circumstances." Eli looked at her with those serious 10-year-old eyes and said, "You are the right circumstances," with the absolute unguarded honesty of a child who has gotten very good at telling the truth quietly. She felt that with her whole chest. She said, "Thank you, Eli." He shrugged, which was how he accepted acknowledgement he did not quite know what to do with, and went back to his carving. Thomas was the last to say anything, and he said it in his own way, which was oblique but deliberate. He was helping her hang wash one morning, a task he had volunteered for without being asked, which was itself significant, and they worked in silence for a while, and then he said, "Eli showed me a new carving." "The hawk," she said, It is beautiful work. He does good work, Thomas said. He handed her a shirt and they worked for another minute. He has not worked much this year, since Mama. She said he is working now. Thomas said, yes, he paused. Things feel different now, she said, better or worse different. He thought about this with that characteristic care. Then he said, better. And then in the voice of someone completing an argument he had been having internally for a long time, it is not replacing her. I understand that now. It is not replacing her, it is just he stopped. More, she offered. He looked at her. Something in his face was almost surprised, as though she had named it more accurately than he had managed to himself. Yes, he said, just more. They finished hanging the wash and she thought, this family that has been carrying its loss so quietly and so long, and was willing, eventually, to let someone sit beside them in it. On a Saturday in August, Jacob Doyle took her into Copperfield for provisions as usual, and as usual left her at the dry goods store while he went to see Walt Hennessy about the regular business of the ranch. But he came back earlier than expected and he said, come with me. I want to show you something. She came with him. He walked her past Walt's office and past the saloon and past the small school that sat at the edge of the main street and stopped in front of the building at the end, which was the Copperfield assay office, or had been. The sign was faded and the building had been empty for over a year since the assay man had moved to Carson City. She looked at it. She said, what am I looking at? He said, a building that has been empty for a year. He looked at it with the calculating assessment he applied to anything that might have structural or practical value. It is a good size, 2 rooms inside and a back area. He glanced at her. The minister has been looking for a place to hold school through the week. The children in Copperfield have nothing since Millie Carson left to get married in the spring. She said, are you thinking about buying it? He said, I am thinking about whether a woman who was a schoolteacher's daughter and has read more books than anyone I have ever met might have an opinion about that. She looked at the building for a long moment. She thought about her father's schoolroom in Elko. She thought about what it meant to have a place that felt like yours. She said, what would need to be done to it? He said, the windows need glass. The inside needs cleaning and probably some woodwork. The roof is sound, I checked. He said this last thing in a tone that suggested he had been planning this for longer than today. Walt says the owner is asking $40, she said. That is not an unreasonable price for a sound building in a growing town. He said, no, it is not. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with that open expression she had come to love, the one where his face said more than his words, and she understood that he was not merely suggesting a community investment. He was asking her something. He was asking her whether she wanted a future in this town, in this place, in this life. She said, Jacob, are you asking what I think you are asking? He said, I do not know how to be indirect about this, so I am going to say it plainly. He turned fully to face her. I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper. As he stopped, and in the pause there was 6 weeks of porch evenings and coffee cups, and the way she had looked with her face turned up to the early morning light until his youngest son had called her sunshine. I want you to be my wife, Sally, if you are willing. The August sun was hot on the boardwalk of Copperfield, Nevada, and a couple of men she recognized from the dry goods store were visible down the street, and a dog was sleeping in the shadow of the building across the way. And the whole ordinary breathing world was continuing as it always did. And she looked at Jacob Doyle standing there with his hat in his hands and his face entirely unguarded for once. And she thought, here is a man who built something from nothing and buried his love in it and kept going anyway. Here is a man whose boys call me Sunshine. Here is a man who writes to lawyers on my behalf and leaves coffee on railings and shows me the future of his ranch like he is showing me a map I will need. She said, yes. He let out a breath. He put his hat back on and then he did something she had not expected from Jacob Doyle. He reached out and took her hand, right there on the main street of Copperfield in full view of anyone who cared to look, and held it with the specific warm certainty of a man who has made a decision he is not going to second guess. She thought, There it is. There is all of it. They were married in September of 1882 in the small church on the east side of Copperfield, by the same minister whose letter of reference had brought Sallie Merriweather to this territory in the first place. The minister performed the ceremony with visible satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who believes he has played a small but meaningful role in an outcome worth celebrating. Pete wore his good shirt and his boots, and his hair was combed into a heroic attempt at neatness that had collapsed by the time they reached the church, but was nonetheless evidence of significant effort. He stood through the whole ceremony with an expression of concentrated joy that occasionally overflowed into small private sounds of approval that he did not entirely succeed in suppressing. Eli wore his good shirt too and held the carved hawk in his coat pocket. She had asked him to bring it, and he had understood why without being told, a piece of what was past and what was present together in the same moment. He did not cry. He stood straight and quiet and watchful, and at the moment the vows were said, she saw his hand go to his coat pocket and press against the carved shape there. Thomas stood beside his father through the ceremony with a gravity that was, she had come to understand, not coldness but depth. After it was over and the small gathering of neighbors and townspeople had offered their congratulations, Thomas came to her specifically, stepped in front of her and held out his hand. She took it. He shook it once with his father's precision and said, "I am glad you stayed." She said, "So am I, Thomas." Jacob Doyle watched this exchange with the expression she had come to love best, the one that was absolutely undefended. He walked her out of the church into the September afternoon, and Copperfield was full of autumn light, that particular quality of light that the desert produces in September, golden and specific, the kind that makes everything look like something worth keeping. He said, "Wife," she said, "say it again." He said, "Sallie Doyle." He tasted it. He looked at her. "That is going to take some getting used to," she said. "We have time." He took her hand again, as easily as he had on the boardwalk in August, and it still felt like the same thing it had felt like then, the gesture of a man who has made his decision and is standing in it. The autumn and winter of 1882 settled over the Doyle Ranch with a particular quality of richness that was entirely new and entirely earned. Sallie Merriweather Doyle learned the full rhythm of the ranch with the same methodical attention she brought to everything: the fall cattle drive, the preparation of the winter stores, the particular demands of a Nevada winter on a working property. And Jacob Doyle discovered over these months that his wife had opinions about almost everything, and that her opinions were, with remarkable consistency, worth hearing. They argued. Not in the way that people who do not understand each other argue, but in the way that Clara had argued with him, and that he had not realized he missed until it started again, the productive clash of two particular minds approaching a problem from different angles. She argued about the south pasture fence, which she thought could be extended another quarter-mile to make use of grass that was currently going to waste. She was right. She argued about Pete's education, which was sporadic in the extreme, and proposed that, when the Copperfield school building opened in the spring, she intended to teach there 2 days a week and Pete would attend every session without exception. He agreed without much argument because she was clearly right about this too. She argued with him one evening in November about the photograph on the mantelpiece. He had not expected this one. She said, "I want to move it." He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. She said, "Not away, not out of sight. I want to put it in the main room where the light is better and where the boys can see it properly, not just on the mantelpiece where it gets dark from the lamp smoke." She deserves better than a mantelpiece in bad light. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where were you thinking?" She showed him. The east wall of the main room where the morning light came in clear and clean. She was right. It was a better place. The photograph looked different there, looked like it had been given proper consideration rather than installed as an obligation. Thomas saw it the next morning and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "That is a better spot." He said it carefully, with the same weight that all Thomas Doyle's words had, and she knew it was the most he could give her, and she took it and was grateful. In February of 1883, she realized she was going to have a child. She sat with this knowledge for a few days before she told Jacob. She told him on a Thursday evening on the porch after the boys had gone inside, in the same place and at the same time where they had first begun to talk about real things, where she had first said she was not going anywhere and where he had said he was afraid of getting used to something good. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. His face did the thing it did when he was preparing to receive significant information, very still, very focused. She said, "We are going to have a child." He did not move for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand with the same simple deliberateness as always and held it, and she looked at him and saw on his face the full weight of what this meant, the joy of it and the fear of it and the specific grief that came from loving Clara and knowing what fever could do, all of it there together, undefended. She said, "I know what you are thinking." He said, "What am I thinking?" She said, "You are thinking about Clara." He was quiet. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "I am strong, Jacob. I am not making you a promise I cannot keep, but I am strong and I intend to be around for a very long time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his mouth, a gesture so uncharacteristic of his usual restraint that it moved through her like something warm and irreversible. He said, "A child," she said, "sometime in September, I think." He said, "Pete is going to be insufferable about this." She laughed. The November stars were out over the Nevada dark, and she laughed with her head back, and beside her Jacob Doyle made the low sound she had come to recognize as the version of laughter he allowed himself when he was very happy. Pete was indeed insufferable. He made his official declaration within 24 hours of being told that he was getting a brother or sister, to the effect that if it was a girl she would need a nickname and he was already thinking about it, and if it was a boy his name should be Pete Jr., and that in either case he, Pete Doyle, intended to be the primary authority on matters of introduction. Thomas told him with great patience that he was not going to be naming anyone, and Pete revised his position slightly to exclusive consultation rights. Eli carved a small figure in the evenings without telling anyone what it was until it was done, and when it was done, he brought it to Sallie, and it was a small wooden bird, a dove, with wings half open, and he gave it to her without explanation, and she kept it on the windowsill of the room she shared with Jacob where the morning light could find it. The school opened in April of 1883 in the old assay building in Copperfield, after Jacob Doyle and two of his neighbors spent 3 days replacing the windows and repairing the floor and painting the sign. Sallie Doyle taught there 2 days a week with a teaching license she applied for through the territorial office in Carson City and received in March. She taught 11 children the first season, 8 the following year as word spread and a few families from outside town sent their children in for the week, and 14 the year after that. She was, by all accounts of the children and their parents, excellent at it. She was, she discovered, a woman who needed something of her own, not instead of the ranch and the family, but alongside it, and Jacob Doyle had known this before she did, which was one of the many specific ways in which he continued to surprise her. Their son was born in early September of 1883. He arrived on a warm morning when the light was coming through the windows, in exactly the way it had come through on the morning Pete had given her her name, gold and flat and generous, and he was healthy and considerable in the way of babies who intend to make an impression, and Jacob Doyle sat beside her afterward with the particular stillness of a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and can finally let it go. She said, "He looks like you." Jacob looked at the baby with an expression she had never seen on his face before, entirely stripped of everything but tenderness. "He looks like Pete at this age," he said, "which means he is going to be impossible." She laughed, exhausted and happy. Pete declared the naming ceremony open and was promptly overruled. They named him William James Doyle, after Sallie's father, James Merriweather, the schoolteacher from Elko who had given her her love of books and her clear, direct way of speaking truth. Jacob Doyle had suggested it himself, quietly, one evening in July when they were discussing names, and she had looked at him and understood that he had been thinking about it for some time and had waited until he was sure it was the right thing to offer. William Doyle was, as predicted, impossible. He was loud and willful, and full of an extravagant joy that Pete recognized as a kindred quality, and immediately took under his informal tutelage. He was also deeply loved by all three of his older brothers with varying degrees of expression. Pete with absolute vocal enthusiasm, Eli with quiet attention and small carved gifts that accumulated on the windowsill beside the dove, Thomas with the grave, protective competence of someone who has decided that guarding something is the best way he knows how to love it. Jacob Doyle held his youngest son in the evenings with the specific ease of a man who is exactly where he is meant to be, and Sallie watched this and thought about the man she had found on that first morning in Copperfield, angular and careful and closed around his own heart like a fist. He was not closed now. He had opened slowly, with enormous care, the way everything he did was done, and what was inside was considerable. She had suspected this from the beginning. She had been right. By the spring of 1885, the Doyle Ranch had expanded to the north as Jacob had intended, the pasture fence he had shown her when he was showing her the future. The cattle operation was profitable and steady. Copperfield itself had grown, a new general store had opened, and a second church and a small hotel that served the stage route, and the school had more students than one teacher could easily manage, which was a good problem to have. Sallie Doyle taught through the spring of 1885, and then in June she told Jacob she was expecting again. He received this news with the same profound, quiet care he had received the first time, though with somewhat less fear, she thought, and somewhat more of the particular tender precision that was his love expressed in its fullest form. Their second child was a daughter. She was born in January of 1886 in the deep cold of a Nevada winter, and she arrived in the world with enormous dark eyes that were Sallie's eyes exactly, and a quantity of dark hair that was ambitious for a newborn, and a disposition that made itself immediately clear as one of organized intent. Thomas named her. He did not announce that he was going to name her. He simply said on the second day, "Her name should be Clara." He said it quietly and directly, looking at his father. Jacob Doyle was very still for a moment. He looked at his oldest son, who looked back at him with 12-year-old grief and 16-year-old steadiness combined, because Thomas Doyle was growing up in the particular direction you grow when you have lost something, and decided to carry it with dignity rather than lay it down. Jacob looked at Sallie. She nodded once, steadily. They named her Clara Jane Doyle. Clara for the woman in the photograph on the east wall in the morning light, and Jane because Sallie thought it was a name with weight, simple and solid, a name that would serve a girl well in whatever she chose to do with it. Thomas held Clara for the first time with the careful, controlled tenderness of someone handling something precious and irreplaceable, and Sallie thought, Here is the boy who would not let me in for weeks because he was guarding his grief and his loyalty, holding his sister named for his mother, and he is 16 years old and he is going to be, in all the ways that matter, a remarkable man. She was right about this, as she was right about most things. Pete, who was now 12 and had not become less himself at all, declared Clara Jane Doyle to be the finest baby in Nevada, a position he had also held about William, and which he saw no contradiction in applying again. Pete Doyle operated at a level of enthusiastic certainty about the things he loved that brooked no revision and tolerated no nuance and was, everyone agreed, one of the more genuinely warming qualities a person could have. Eli was 17 now, quiet and precise and good in a way that was not performance but character, and he carved a small horse, Clara's horse, and put it on the windowsill with the dove and the accumulation of other small careful things he had made over the years for this family, This collection of people who had slowly, one by one, decided to be given and received. The photograph stayed on the east wall. Clara Jane Doyle grew up looking at the woman she was named for in the Good Morning Light, and she grew up knowing the story, which Sallie told her and her brothers told her, and Jacob Doyle told her in his serious, measured way. The story of a fair-haired woman from California who had been stubborn and cheerful, and had argued with her husband about everything, which Thomas confirmed was an entirely accurate description, and said it with something very close to a smile. The story of their family was not a simple story. It had grief in it, the deep, long grief of a man and 3 boys in a quiet house. It had a dark past in it, a woman who had left Reno with her traveling case and her references and her steady hands. It had a false complaint and a lawyer's letter and an old assay building turned school, and a porch with 2 chairs and coffee on the railing. It had a nickname in it. A 7-year-old boy standing at a kitchen window, watching a woman turn her face up to the Nevada morning light and saying, with the perfect simple clarity of a child who has not yet learned to complicate the things he knows, "She looks like sunshine." It had a rancher, later that same morning, standing in his own doorway and hearing the word and stepping back out onto the porch and pressing his hand to the doorframe and breathing through it, the specific held breath of a man who has just recognized something he had not expected and has not yet decided what to do about it. And then it had him going back inside and sitting down at the kitchen table and asking where it had come from, not because he needed to know the logistics of the nickname, but because he needed an excuse to begin the conversation that would eventually become the rest of his life. By the summer of 1887, Thomas was 19 and working the ranch full-time alongside his father with the competence of a young man who had been learning the work since he could lift a fence post. He had the same quiet precision, the same economical certainty, and he was beginning to develop his own opinions about the operation that Jacob Doyle listened to with the seriousness he had always applied to things worth hearing. They argued about the north pasture irrigation and the timing of the fall drive and the management of the herd's lineage, and it was productive and good, the argument of 2 capable people who respected each other. Eli was 18 and had begun to think about going to Nevada City to study engineering, a decision he arrived at with his characteristic quiet deliberateness, and discussed with Sallie first, on an evening on the porch, because she was the person in the family who had read the most about the world beyond this valley and whose opinion he trusted on matters of direction. She told him honestly that she thought he should go, that the work he was meant to do was larger than a ranch in Nevada, and that going somewhere and building something and coming back was not the same as leaving. He said, "You came here from somewhere else." She said, "Yes. And it made all the difference that I came here knowing what I needed rather than running from what I had lost." He considered this with those careful eyes that had not changed in the 10 years since he had shown her his carving on the back porch on a Thursday morning. Then he said, "I think I know what I need." She said, "Then you should go after it." He left in August of 1887, not without difficulty and not without considerable emotion on Pete's part, who declared that the family was diminishing and that someone should do something about it, and on Jacob's part, who walked Eli to the stage and said a long goodbye in the specific vocabulary they had developed together over 20 years of being a father and a son. Eli shook his hand and then pulled him in briefly, and Jacob held on for a moment longer than he usually permitted himself. He came back for Christmas and for the summers, and he wrote letters in his careful, precise hand that were full of the things he was learning and thinking. And eventually he sent a letter telling them about a woman he had met in Nevada City whose name was Harriet and who was, he said, extremely intelligent and had a particular way of looking at problems that he found interesting. And Sallie read this letter to Jacob in the kitchen, and they looked at each other with the specific shared understanding of 2 people who know exactly what extremely intelligent and interesting actually means in the vocabulary of a careful man in love. Pete grew up louder and warmer and more himself than anyone had predicted. He had Jacob's eyes and Sally's directness, and some quality that was entirely his own, an irrepressible and specific joy that met everything with the conviction that it was probably going to be fine and quite possibly excellent. He was not a ranching man in his soul, which Jacob understood and accepted with a grace that Sally loved him for. Pete had a talent for horses that was different from ranching, more specific and more personal. And by the time he was 14, he was known in Copperfield and surrounding areas as the boy who could gentle a difficult animal, a skill that turned, over the following years, into a real and lucrative trade. William grew up the way strong-willed youngest sons of large families grow up, shaped by the accumulated input of 4 older brothers and 2 parents with considerable opinions, and emerged at 10 and 11 and 12 as a person of definite character, funny and tenacious, and deeply loyal to the people he loved with the specific ferocity of someone who has grown up entirely surrounded by love and intends to produce it in return. Clara Jane Doyle grew up knowing exactly who she was named for and what it meant, and she grew up with her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's name, and the photograph on the east wall where the light was good, and she was not a replacement, and had never been asked to be one. She was herself, entirely and specifically, and she was loved in her own right by every person in that house. The Doyle Ranch moved through the years with the particular continuity of places that are genuinely cared for. The buildings were maintained, and the land was worked with attention, and the cattle operation grew, and the school in Copperfield continued, and Sally Doyle taught there, until William was old enough to be at school himself. And then she took on more days and eventually became the school's full authority, hiring a second teacher when the enrollment required it, managing the small enterprise with the organized precision she brought to everything. Jacob Doyle watched his wife manage the school and manage the ranch household, and manage the slow, beautiful growth of their family, and managed, over the years, to say more of what he felt than he had ever said in his life before her, which was still less than most men but was, for Jacob Doyle, an enormous and ongoing act of will and love. He said it in other ways, too. He said it in the coffee cup left exactly where she needed it. He said it in the east wall where the photograph lived in good light. He said it in the north pasture fence he had extended because she had told him it was worth extending, and in the school building he had bought and repaired because he had known what she needed before she had named it, and in 20 years of evenings on the porch where the second chair was always occupied, and the Nevada stars came out enormous and indifferent over the desert, and they talked about everything and said the things that mattered. On a June morning in 1892, 10 years after the stage had brought Sallie Merriweather into Copperfield with her leather case and her references, she was in the kitchen making bread, and Pete came in from outside at his usual unceremonious speed. He was 22 now, broad-shouldered and full of himself in the most affectionate possible way, and he came in and stopped in the kitchen doorway and said, "Morning, sunshine," with the easy warmth of someone using a word that has always been true. She looked up at him and smiled. She said, "Good morning, Pete." Jacob Doyle came in through the back door a moment later, hat in hand, the way he always came in from the morning work, and he heard Pete's greeting, and he stopped in the doorway the way he had stopped in a different doorway on a different June morning 10 years ago. Pete went back out. Jacob stood in the doorway. Sally looked up at him over the bread dough. "Ed, you are doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" she said, standing in the doorway looking like a man who has just heard something he is working out. He crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table, the same kitchen, 10 years of mornings accumulated in the wood of it and the light on the walls. He poured himself coffee from the pot she had left on the stove. He said, "I was thinking about the first time I heard him say it." She kept working the dough. "And," he looked at her. "And I was thinking that it was the most exact thing, for once." She looked at him. This man at 47, with more silver in his hair and more history in his face and the same specific gravity that she had been drawn to from the first moment on the boardwalk of Copperfield, this man sitting at her kitchen table in the morning light with his coffee cup and his unhidden face. She said, "It was the most exact thing." He said, "I should have asked you sooner." She said, "You asked when you were ready." He said, "I mean I should have asked where it came from sooner. The first morning." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the answer would have told me everything I needed to know." He looked at her steadily. "That my sons had already done what I was too careful to do. They had just decided you were ours." She stopped her work. She looked at him fully, the way she had on so many mornings and evenings and ordinary, extraordinary days of this life, and she thought about Pete in the kitchen window 10 years ago saying she looks like sunshine with the perfect, clear certainty of a boy who knows what he knows. She thought about Thomas's careful handshake at their wedding. She thought about Eli's dove on the windowsill. She thought about William at 2 years old deciding she was the funniest person in any room, a position he had never revised. She said, "They were wiser than you." He said, "They usually are." She put flour on her hands and picked up the bread dough, and she thought, "This is it. This is the whole of what I came here for and what I found and what was made from it. A man who says I should have asked sooner and means it. A family that named me before its head knew what it was doing. A life in the Nevada desert that is mine in every sense that matters." She thought, "I came to Copperfield with a leather case and a letter and a look on my face of someone starting over from something that had cost her considerably, and what I got was this, which is worth more than anything I was starting over from could ever have cost." She thought, "My boys call me Sunshine," and the rancher asked later where it had come from, and the answer was, "From the place where love begins, which is recognition, which is simply one person seeing another person accurately and naming what they see." She said, "Jacob." He said, "Yes," she said, "I am glad you went back inside that morning." He looked at her for a moment with his undefended face. Then he said, "So am I, Sally." He looked down at his coffee cup and back up at her. Every morning since. Outside, over the Nevada desert, the June light was coming in flat and gold, and generous the way it always did in this season, the way it had on the morning a 7-year-old boy had looked out a kitchen window and found the word that was already, somehow, exactly true. The ranch breathed around them. The cattle moved in the far pasture. The school building in Copperfield sat solid and full of children who were being taught to read and to think, and to know that the world was larger than where they started. Thomas Doyle worked the north pasture with his father's precision, and his mother's steady eye for what was worth expanding. Pete was likely arguing with a horse somewhere with great enthusiasm and ultimate success. William was probably already in motion toward something with the irrepressible forward velocity that was his particular gift. Clara Jane was going to grow up knowing her name was both a tribute and an inheritance, and neither a burden nor a replacement, because she had been born into a family that had learned, slowly and with considerable effort and love, how to hold more than one true thing at the same time. And Jacob Doyle sat at the kitchen table of the house he had built with his own hands and bled on and buried his grief in, and then, eventually, on a June morning that changed the shape of everything, walked back inside with his heart hammering like a green colt hitting a fence, and asked the question that had started it all. Where did the name come from? It came from here, from this family, from these people who had found in Sallie Merriweather, and she in them, the precise and irreplaceable thing that makes a house into a home, and a collection of people into something you would call, without hesitation, yours. It came from love, which is what names always come from when they are given freely and received without condition, which is the only way that any of it, is ever truly worth anything. The bread was rising by the window. The coffee was warm between Jacob Doyle's hands. Outside in the Nevada morning, a 7-year-old's nickname echoed forward through 10 years and would echo forward still, through all the mornings that were coming, through all the names and the light and the accumulated weight of a life built carefully and truly, one post at a time. Sunshine. It was, everyone agreed, the most exact thing.